So thank you for having me, specifically climate change politics, and my most recent book, which is called Climate Travels. Who's heard of climate change? Can
4 times a year. I'm good.
Although in Florida you have to be careful about using that phrase if you work for the state.
Yes.
That's what I hear. You can't escape it, right? This book, though, has been a product, just like the previous one that I worked on, of my frustration with the fact that despite the scientists each year getting a better and better grasp of the complications that are involved when it comes to climate change, the American public has been relatively split in terms of the problem that climate change presents and whether or not that's something that we need to act on. And as I was thinking about that over the years, I wanted to explore the why of that. And I have a few slides here that kind of get into just the science of climate change a little bit, and then more so in terms of me being not a true scientist, but a social scientist, the politics of it. This is a slide that is based on modern temperature gathering equipment, which we have here in the United States. We've had available for about 130 years now, back to 1895. Globally, we can use data that goes back even 10 years before that. And over that period, you can see that the hottest years on record all fall within the last decade. Now, we can get temperature data that goes back even further based on proxy data, based on a number of things. You can take coral reef samples, you can take tree core samples, and the best of all, and the furthest back, are ice core samples. So we can actually extrapolate what the temperature was from these other sources 650,000 years back. And this is all important. Now, it's proxy data, so it's not as accurate as the modern temperature gathering equipment that we have now today and have had for over a century. But it is pretty good to use, and being able to go back that far is a big deal. And that's important because, a little too fast, got a little clicker happy. Because, as you know, the weather day to day changes. And sometimes we have abnormally cold days. And there's a certain candidate for president way back in 2016 who loved to tweet about that when he was on Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, I guess, right? That it was really cold out. What's this bunk about climate change? Well, day to day, month to month, year to year, and even for 29 years plus, if you have that type of data, you still can't really talk about climate. That's still just weather. You need 30 years worth of weather data to begin to talk about climate and climate change. And so it's important to remember when you see abnormally cold days, that doesn't discount what 97%, 98%, 99% of climate scientists have been arguing for decades now when it comes to climate change. And again, so my question over the last dozen years has been, given the fact that we have gotten stronger and stronger in our scientific understanding about the complex problems that come with climate change, why is it that we have, in the United States at least, and the United States is an outlier. It's an outlier along with Australia and Russia when it comes to public opinion about climate change. Why are we an outlier? And that's what this is supposed to dictate. But the question why, these are actually Sierra Club activists in Cancun during a conference of parties for the United Nations Climate Change Convention back in 2010. I'll get my clicker right here in a second. And they were protesting the lack of action at the international level. So we've had lack of action at the national level, we've had lack of action at the international level. And again, there's a lot of reasons at the international level. I'd be happy to get into maybe a question and answer section if you're curious. But this project, this most recent project, was focusing on the United States. And I think there are half a dozen core reasons we could get into in terms of why. But one of them is pretty basic. Anybody recognize this poster?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. This is the famous Earth Day poster by Walt Kelly, and he was meaning to parody naval commander from the War of 1812. But a basic phenomena work that you are familiar with your group is that unlike major conflicts that the United States has been involved in the past, the enemy is us. It's our behaviors, it's what we do. And obviously this is even more complicated because it's not just what we do, it's what China does, it's what Europe does, it's what all the rest of the world does. But this was a poster that was targeting pollution, but you can extrapolate that to talk about greenhouse gases as the pollution that we have been accelerating in our emissions. All right, so my apologies on this not transferring right, but we didn't want to push our luck. If we can get at least some of the slide up there, we're going to go with it. So I think the next slide will show it a little bit better. Back in 2008, the Yale Center on Climate Change decided that it would be helpful if we looked at public opinion in the United States as something more than just simply yes and no. That yes, I think climate change is a problem, no, I don't. And what they created were 6 different categories: alarmed, concerned, cautious. There's a denier there at the end. Let's see if this has it a little bit better. Yeah, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive were the next 2. So again, apologies for that. But what they found over the years is that the bottom categories haven't really changed much. And when you think about American politics on other issues, that kind of makes sense, right? But what I would argue from this 10 years of data here is if you look at the top, in particular, we've seen some progress in terms of Americans and their feeling, again, just feeling, that climate change is a problem. And so I would argue that's actually a plus, that people are coming to better grips, better understanding with that. Now, I'll have to walk through this a little bit. So there's a lot of, this is a Gallup poll, I think that Yale Program on Climate Change Communication helped with. And there's a lot about here that shows, in yellow are folks that agree that it's a problem, and in blue you can see that they're saying that it's not. They're not concerned. And it's this one right here that I want to tap into in particular. And I'll paraphrase it for you. It's cut off a little bit at the beginning. But basically it's asking, the question was, do you believe that climate change is harming you personally? And you can see with that under half of the respondents said that they did. And that got me thinking, and it got me borrowing from a couple other much more noted folks about what they had done to move the needle in terms of public understanding. And here we have former Vice President Al Gore. That is getting cut off, but that was an inconvenient truth. That came out, I believe, in I want to say 2006 or 2007. It was right around then. He then ended up sharing the Nobel Peace Prize with, I think, almost 24 scientists that were working for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, including a famous climate scientist named Michael Mann. And that attention from this documentary, which won, I think, an Academy Award for Best Documentary, that public attention really started to move the needle in 2007 and 2008. But then by the summer of 2008, you may remember, something else happened. And we went into a Great Recession here in the United States by late 2008. And that just kind of put the brakes on a lot of momentum that was happening. Even the US Congress, God forbid, was considering climate change legislation. It made it through the House right around that same time. The Senate put the brakes on it, and we never got that. But there was a lot of action going on there, and got a fat thumb here that's advancing too quickly. All right, there. Anybody recognize this?
Yosemite. Yellowstone.
Yosemite is a good guess, but it is Yellowstone. And specifically, it's the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. Do you know who did it? You can see it in the museum at the, I think it's the Department of, I think it's the Natural History Museum, or is it in the Interior Department that they have a little section? It's a fellow named Thomas Moran, and he was commissioned to go with a group out west to help develop momentum back in the Congress and the public at large for creating the world's first national park, Yellowstone. And this is a famous painting that he came back with, and my point of putting it here in the slideshow is to show the power of the visual. Thomas Moran could be there in person, but the members of the Congress couldn't, and the general public at large couldn't. But this was a way for him to sell that experience and help make the case for creating Yellowstone National Park. Now, there was something else that was very interesting that happened. Oh, wait, that slide comes later. Sorry. Here's another image. This is Apollo 17. This image went into the public domain, so everybody from Hummer Corporation, Hummer commercials to Audubon Society commercials probably were using this. Anybody had access to it for free. But this was it's called the Blue Marble, I believe. And this is a famous photograph that, again, was often credited as developing a new consciousness about how we think about environmental issues. All right, so lots cut out of here. But this is Mark Twain. This is a famous quote that you might have seen from time to time. But basically, he's making an argument for travel. And this idea that the way we really learn, the way we particularly jump creatively and think in a different way is when we get exposed to different ways of doing things through travel. And I've often argued, I like to travel. I like to experience new cultures, new foods, meet new people. But one of the undersold benefits to travel, and this next guy, Rick Steves, talks about it too. So modern day Mark Twain in a way, at least in terms of the television shows that he does, is that it helps us better understand also where we come from through travel, and understand what our strengths are and what our weaknesses are, and then hopefully be motivated to improve upon those weaknesses. And so again, this project is trying to tap into this frustration of the fact that Americans tend to think of climate change as distant, both temporally, so for the next generation or the generation after that, and spatially, so for maybe Bangladesh, because 3/4 of their country is at 15 feet above or below sea level. And so that's a problem for over there or later on, not here and now. But as we've seen over the last quarter century, there are increasingly events that have happened in the United States that tell a different story. And again, me thinking about, well, what is it that we can tap into regardless of political ideology? Because when you think about it, environmental issues historically have not been partisan issues, right? You think of Republican President Teddy Roosevelt, who was instrumental in helping create the national park system that followed Yellowstone. You think of the vast majority of major environmental regulations we have on the books today, those happened under President Richard Nixon. 2 examples of Republicans. And you think of the very definition of conservatism is trying to keep things the way they are. There's lots of reasons to be pro-environment from the right side of the spectrum, not just the left side of the spectrum. Well, same thing with national parks. Now this isn't counting each individual visitor. What's the best way to say it? This is total number of visits. So it's not that every American 2 years ago, minus 20 million, went and visited a national park. We're counting repeat visits. But I think the number still jumps out at you, right? That's a lot of people going to national parks in the United States. And this was after COVID, so it wasn't just people had nothing else to do and descended on national parks, if you remember. It became quite a problem.
It wasn't all Americans either.
What's that?
It wasn't all Americans.
That's true. It wasn't just Americans. But during COVID, it probably was just much higher proportion of Americans than typically because of the different travel restrictions. In any case, national park systems, another example of people traveling, experiencing directly, and hopefully some motivation afterwards to do something different. Here's a map of the United States. You can't really see it from where you are probably, but it's a map that shows the different national parks. And this is the final point I want to make in terms of some lessons over the last century plus in terms of politics and the environment when it comes to climate change. Not the best clarity there, but basically what's going on, and you're missing some of the cutoff, is it's showing a map of railroads and national parks. And in addition to Thomas Moran's painting, the biggest variable that helped Congress sell a national park system in the subsequent decades was support from the railroad magnates. Because what they saw were dollar signs. They saw an opportunity to ship where most Americans live, east of the Mississippi. If you can get them to Chicago, then you can get them all to all the national parks out west, and you can make money on it. And so what you saw there was a marriage of a major economic entity in terms of the railroad elite and the national park idea. And I think that's what's sort of been missing in the United States when it comes to climate change. For a while there, I thought it was going to be the insurance industry. But the fossil fuel industry has just proved too strong and too powerful for the insurance industry to match up with that. All right, so now to some pretty pictures. So this book project, I'll just kind of whip through some of it, and I can maybe read a little section if you want me to, but maybe just move to questions and answers. This book project, the first half of it looks at the threats underway in the United States. So I look at 8 core threats of climate change that we're facing right here, right now in the United States. And there's a lot of places that you could say are ground zero in the United States. Certainly California can make a bit of a case. Alaska can certainly make a case. But I would put my chips more so with Florida. Florida is in many ways ground zero. They're at least half of the core threats we face on an annual basis here in Florida. And this book, over that first half, crisscrosses through, well, really all across the country. So it goes from Florida to Alaska, Maine to California, but then it also goes to Tennessee, excuse me, Texas, Virginia, Oregon. I might be leaving some, Kansas. It's got a chapter or two on Kansas. So it really is covering different sections, trying to make the case that anywhere in the United States, you can go see with relatively short distance the impacts of climate change unfolding right now. The second half of the book looks at solutions. Solutions that are already underway, but need to be scaled up. They're happening at the local level, which is great. But if we're really going to solve this, they have to be scaled up. And so here's an example. One of the chapters, this is Biscayne National Park. This was one of my kids. This is during COVID, as you can see. But one of the chapters there looks at sort of the probably the least told story of climate change, the impacts on the oceans. This ended up being a Fox day, and we were able to sneak away and do a 6-hour tour with 6 other people. It's just 8 of us, and this really, really amazing April morning down at Key Biscayne National Park. Anybody recognize this particular slide?
Denali?
Yeah, that's right. That's Denali National Park in Alaska. There, like I said, that can make a case for a ground zero, because obviously there's problems with the cryosphere, the ice melting away in Alaska. It's so bad that they're worried about, I didn't climb Denali by any stretch or means, but they're worried that the decades and decades of climbing that has happened there, sometimes those climbers have to do the business and leave it, and now they're worried about that fecal contamination because of the melt. It's still got the bacteria, the microbes, dangerous microbes in it. That's not the kind of concern you think would be, but that's how crazy this is. So yes, we've got the melt problem, but Alaska has more wildfires than anywhere else in the United States combined. That's a horrible problem as well, that is being exacerbated by climate change, and I can get into that more later too if you want. Anybody recognize this one? It's the 5th most visited national park. It takes advantage of being east of the Mississippi in a population center.
It's Jordan Pond.
That's right, Jordan Pond in Acadia National Park. And these are 2 of my other characters there. That's on Cadillac Mountain. So I believe the saying is that's the first place in the United States you can see sunrise from Cadillac Mountain. Whoops, too fast. We all know this one as Floridians.
St. Augustine?
Yeah, the Bridge of Lions in St. Augustine. And then there can be horrible storms, like I believe this one's Hurricane Matthew. But, it doesn't have to be a bad storm for St. Augustine to have a problem with flooding. It could just be high tide. With sea level rise, and also subsidence, that's another issue. In some ways connected, not to the climate change that's happening, but the causes of climate change. The fact that we're pumping stuff out creates this part of the subsidence problem. But it doesn't have to be raining for places like St. Augustine to have a flooding problem. It could simply be a high tide, or in particular, the highest tide of the year, the king tides, right? Particularly here in the northern hemisphere, that's in the fall, is the bad one. So that could be a problem on a beautiful sunny day. And in fact, a few years back, I was down with the Climate Leadership Corps, the group that Al Gore started to try and get people to do a version of his Inconvenient Truth in their own communities. And he picked that day expressly so that it would be the King Tide Day. And then he went out, and well, this is Miami Beach. And he went out that morning with reporters, and the sunny day. I don't think this was, this was the exact same year. So this was a few years back. And this has gotten so bad that Miami Beach has committed $600,000 now to raising the streets and instituting a pump system to pump out this tidal water. And they recognize that that's only going to get them about another 25 years. And then they'd have to start all over if that's what they choose. So, again, doesn't have to be a Hurricane Matthew or something else for cause problems here in Florida along the coast with flooding. But to move up the intercoastal, this is also a problem that the U.S. military is thinking about. This is the largest naval station in the world, Norfolk Naval Station. And they're committing, I should have double-checked my math on this, but they're committing, I think it's in the neighborhood of $1 billion, maybe it's north of it, to redoing their docks for the U.S. submarines because of sea level rise. Now, they have to be very careful how they talk about that, because you know how our U.S. Congress is. And if they use the words climate change in asking for appropriations, they could get cut off. But that's what they're doing, and they have plenty of public documents out there that talk about climate change, the military does, because they think of it as a threat multiplier. It's creating problems that already exist, making them even worse for the military to deal with. And here, just in terms of readiness back home, that's an issue. Now, I'm not sure if the next slide is still what I thought it was going to be. Yeah. So this is the main road into Norfolk Naval Station on one of those sunny days. So again, storms, sea level rise, a problem for the actual base, but just getting to the base can be a problem, even when there's not a storm. Anybody ever been to Nashville, Tennessee? This is Nashville 14 years ago, in May 2010, after 13 inches in 36 hours. And one of the chapters gets into this. Again, there's a few other variables at work here. But sort of the Where's Waldo of all this is climate change. And this is downtown. This is historic 2nd Avenue is just over, it's not that initial street, but the one right behind that building in the foreground, if you've been to Nashville. And then Broadway is, where is Broadway? I'm looking at it from a little different angle, I think. I think Broadway might actually be right here, just out of the frame. But all kinds of damage. I think there was the figure was something like 12,000 structures were damaged. Not all of them were damaged beyond repair, but that one definitely was. I saw the number $1 billion. I think it was 1.1 billion in economic damage, and there could have been much higher. There were I think it was 8 or 9 deaths that were attributed to it. Anybody seen this photo before? So until this past fall, the fires in Maui. This was the most damaging fire in U.S. history in terms of casualties. Yeah, this is Paradise, California, November 2018.
I thought it was a mobile home park in Pinellas County.
This actually isn't a mobile home park. This is a subdivision. And what's crazy about it, right here's the fire station. So I was interviewing the fire chief there, and then had a chance to make it through that neighborhood. Again, there are several other complicating variables here, including what they call it WUI, the wildland-urban interface. The fact that we're continuing to build in places that we really shouldn't be building in. But I will also tell you that I went from San Francisco in about 48, 49 degrees, 4 hours north, and by the time I got to Paradise, it was 113. So I more than doubled my temperature by going into this area of California that is increasingly susceptible. Fire season starts earlier, ends later. There's more invasive vegetation that can be problematic in terms of being the starter for this. There's a lot of different things going on, but again, the where's Waldo is climate change. The fact that as temperatures rise, it's extracting more moisture from the ground, and then that makes it more susceptible, dry, to fire. Ironically, it also means that when it finally does rain, then you can have floods. So you can have drought and floods in the very same place, or floods and wildfires in the very same place in the same year. Probably haven't heard of this one. This one goes back to 2007. It's a tiny little town in Kansas called, ironically, Greensburg.
Yeah.
They tapped into that. They were very creative, and they tapped into that name. It was a town of about 1,500 at the time. Now it's half that. But 95% of the buildings in that town were destroyed when it was about 1.9, so nearly 2 mile wide tornado hit head on. And like I said, 95% of the structures were destroyed. Well, this town shows up in both the first half and the second half of the book because the town decided that they would rebuild green. And they have the highest percentage of public LEED buildings in the country. And there were a few other things that they did along the way too. But what's really interesting to me is in 2016, the county in which this town is located, 86% of them voted for President Trump. And then in 2020, it was, I don't think it was 87, I think it was 86.7% of them voted again for President Trump. So this is not some little blue dot in the middle of the red state of Kansas. This is a conservative Republican bastion that decided that they were going to do something different with how they rebuilt their town, and that they would do something different with green in mind, that they would make them their town both public and private. I had a chance to talk with a number of private homeowners too, as energy efficient as they possibly could. Now, they weren't doing this just out of the kindness of the heart for the rest of us. They also saw the bottom line here. In particular, the private homeowners did. That they saw this as an investment so they could be making money by year 5, 6, or 7 because of the way they saw utility prices going. All right. Good, the graphics at least work. Now, again, several variables at work here. We're more people, more buildings in places we shouldn't be putting buildings, but we're also having more severe storms. And the economic impact perhaps can mimic what that slide I showed you before with the railroad magnets and the national parks. Increasingly, we are having reason economically to act now, not just act years from now, because we are having these problems each year. Now, I want to be careful before some climate scientist comes after me. I do not want to sit here and tell you that X hurricane is intense. They'll last longer because they're fed from warmer waters. You remember that temperature down in South Florida last summer that was, I think, 101, highest that they ever had recorded in the Atlantic Ocean. So they'll last longer, and it means that they'll hurt much more than just the Gulf states and Florida and a little bit on there on the eastern coast. Like they'll go deeper into Georgia, they'll go deeper into South Carolina, they maybe even reach still at hurricane status further than that because they have more energy, more intensity. All right, I hope this one might get cut off. Yeah, you can't see the dates here. So this was a few years back, and he doesn't like to pose for photos, but he is standing at 2005, the year he was born, and this was in 2019, so this was 5 years ago, and he was 14 at the time. So he's standing here, and this glacier, I wish I could have measured the distance there for you, but you could kind of tell that it's probably approaching 100 feet back. This glacial retreat that we just hear about abstractly, when you this particular park, it's very striking when you see it. So I made him stand by where the glacier was in 2005, and that's where it was when we took the picture in 2019. It's so bad that the visitor center that was built by the national parks to see the glacier, it's in the forest. Yeah, you can't see anything from the special visitor center that they built to view the glacier. It's another, gosh, must be almost approaching a half mile through the forest. So this is again, it's sort of a very in-your-face visual of the problem of the melting cryosphere. This is back to Acadia, and this jumps a couple chapters from the first half to the second half as well. I was fortunate to get funding to go up to Acadia and work for a scientist that was conducting research based on several decades of work from scientists before. And particularly what they were doing is they were looking at the changes in species. What was the impact of climate change on the forest cover? And so that was a really great experience. You can see the grad assistant was showing us how we had to lay out these plots and then collect data each morning. This was a part of Acadia National Park, but was one of the islands that people don't ever really get to. Of course, the famous island that people go to most often is Desert Island. And then a week or two later, my family came up, and we got to be there for the 4th of July. And one of the chapters starts off with the American lobster, because there's a story there. But on the 4th of July, they have lobster races. Sort of they tip what you might think of as like a bookshelf, and you have 5 or 6 lobsters, and you get to put down a $1 bet, and it benefits the YMCA scholarship fund, and they make a whole big deal of it. The story of the lobster, though, if you want me to read a section, is that by the time I retire, there will no longer be the genius of American lobster in American waters. Lobsters don't really technically migrate, but their center is shifting in a northeasterly direction, so we'll have to ask the Canadians for approval to get American lobster in about 12 years. really an amazing story, because over the years, lobstering was a big business in many areas in the northeastern part of the United States. But as this area has been shifting, the southern New England states have been losing out, and the boom that's happening in Maine is just amazing. So like a high school teenager can make $60,000 in the summer. It's so much of a problem that sometimes they just don't go back to school because the money's so good. But it's not going to last. This is just to kind of depict some more that's linking back to that Key Biscayne trip that we've heard of. Ocean, coral reef bleaching. There's also ocean acidification. That's a problem. And then the last chapter of the first half gets into just the very basic heat. More Americans die from climate change related heat problems than any other climate change problems, and it's not as sexy as some major disaster because it's just day in and day out throughout the summer. There's a website you may be familiar with called Climate Central that has all kinds of really cool graphics and ways to depict this. Everything from like you could look at the 50-year history of your favorite NFL football team's opening day temperatures to the number of days above 90 degrees during the summer, or the number of days in which the temperature doesn't drop below 85 degrees at night, or all kinds of different things that you can look at. And they do a really great job of depicting that graphically.
That's mine.
We've had examples. I don't know, do you guys remember about, I want to say around 2017 in the summer, the Phoenix airport had to shut down? Remember that? So it's getting so hot sometimes that the planes, this was, I think this was with some of the smaller ones that they couldn't use. It was an American airline, Eagles, I believe. But it's literally starting to affect the ability of airports to work. This is, my daughter just graduated from the University of Richmond. This is a story, again, I could go into some more detail here if people are curious, but again, it's about the heat. And this goes all the way back to the New Deal in the 1930s. And there's a lot of positive things that historically we associate with that, but one of the untold negative pieces to that story is the redlining that took place to try and encourage white people to be optimistic about their property and their property values. And the impact was very racist on the non-white, on the black and brown. And we can still see this today at a number of, I think it's the maps that were discovered a few years back. They total about 240 different significant cities around the country. And we can see there's a lot of ways when you digitize these maps that you can really uncover some statistics that jump out at you. But one thing that jumps out to you is when you look at those red lines that were drawn by the government in conjunction with the banking system, is that these areas don't have green space. They don't have tree coverage. They are hot spots. And these areas have disproportionately high ambulance calls, emergency visits, health problems. And this is 2024. It's tied all the way back to the 1930s. So the redlining racist past of the early 20th century is still with us, and climate change is magnifying those problems. This is again from Climate Central. The credit is getting cut off there in the bottom right. But by the end of this century, you can see where this trend is going. Oop. Something more about lobsters, and we'll stop here. I'll stop here. I know we got a late start because of my technical deficiencies, but if you have any questions and answers, I'm happy to take those now. Yes, ma'am.
The retreating glacier photo, what park is that?
I tried to double check that. It's within vicinity of Anchorage.
Is it Mendenhall?
I was wanting to say that it was Mendenhall, but I'm not entirely possible. That is one that is popularly visited. But let me check that, and I can get it to Joyce, so you know. But yeah, it's somewhere in that area. That's a good question. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of the 28 million visitors and a 3.6 billion economic impact to the Florida state parks? That's 175 parks.
I didn't know the exact numbers, but yes. Yeah. Again, as you probably recall, under Governor Rick Scott, the terms climate change, he was very smart about this and made sure this wasn't in any written form. So the directive was orally given, but the Florida Department of Environment was told they couldn't talk about climate change at all. And you may have seen this recent signing by Governor DeSantis as of July 1. There's going to be new legislation in place that's doing all kinds of negatives with our moving away from mandates that state agency meetings happen in what are considered green hotels, that you can't take energy efficiency into account when you're buying your supplies, all kinds of issues. But I think there's 9 different spots where term climate change was taken out of existing regs and that sort of thing.
I think DeSantis also has a signed, like for Memorial Day weekend, it's free admission to the Florida state parks. So I mean, he's doing pretty good. I'm really a super fan of him, but still.
He had a period early in his tenure where he was doing some work with red tide, particularly on the Gulf side, trying to make inroads on the problems that's presented there from effluents, particularly. You know, we like to point our fingers at industry, but a lot of times this is coming more from just residents' dependence on fertilizers and other types of chemicals on their lawns. So there are things that you could say, but in general, I think it's this obsession of climate change being a Trojan horse with a bunch of liberals hidden inside that are going to come out in the middle of the night and take away our gas stoves and our ice cream and our hamburgers and all that stuff. So
Gas stoves, no, it's a separate issue. It's carbon monoxide is the problem. I saw a presentation by the South Florida Water Management District at the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council this week, and I'll give credit to DeSantis for this on restoration of the Everglades, because that's going to allow more water to flow to Florida Bay, so the salinity will be dropping to where it should be, and also the livelihoods of the Native Americans there in the Everglades will be better than it has been in the last 10 years.
We're making, the Everglades will probably never in any of our lifetimes be what they once were, but we have at least recognized our transgressions there, and we're trying our best to save what's left and reverse some of the problems. I think what is interesting is we have seen, that's an example with the Everglades of, I think, a bipartisan agreement that's something we want to do our best to protect.
That and on the Indian River Lagoon and other lagoons, they're finding that we know oysters will filter out the air, but also over the water rather, but any bivalve mollusk will filter out the water as well. Clams and et cetera will filter the water as well.
That was what was really interesting about Key Biscayne,
Mhm.
is we were able to see some of that. And that was just a handful of miles.
Right.
You could actually see the Miami skyline from the place where we were at. So that's very true. So you can measure water quality by the health of those species.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So I try to promote the fact that the Lake of Hopkod North Shore has tremendous ecotourism impact on the Central Florida area. I'm using a 2018 St. John's River Water Management District study that they did with the University of Florida. That's where I think it was. And they interviewed people coming out of the wildlife drive, exhaustive interview about where they spent their money. And they came up with 3.6 million impact at that time in 2018. And so extrapolating from the ride, I might put to 6 million. But I write an op-ed and it gets published like every other year. And otherwise, nobody's talking about that. Any suggestions?
Anyway. It's the best kept secret we got in the air there.
So everybody's probably heard the term ecotourism. For it to be true ecotourism, that means that not only do you have a light footprint when you do your visit, but that the money you spend stays where you are.
Right.
So it's not like some major corporate hotel where the money goes back to that. It's the people that live there benefit from you making your visit, and thus they have incentive to be partners in the conservation and protection. That's the idea. A lot of times you'll see hotels say that they're tourist friendly, or they believe in ecotourism. That might not necessarily be the case. It might be what some academics have called ecotourist light. That they're just saving money by saying you can put a little sign on your hotel bed and say you're not going to wash the sheets tonight or something like that. So, that's better than nothing, but that's not the true thing. In terms of your question though, recommendations, I would say looking to local groups to be partners to help tell that story of why this is not just aesthetically pleasing area, but actually has a financial benefit to it. But I think there's a famous climate scientist named Catherine Hayhoe, and she's talked about the best thing that we can do individually is talk about climate change. So the more that you could reach out to other allies, to groups, to talk with them, have them tell that story too, I think that would be beneficial. And particularly if you can do, again, hearkening back to some of these other examples, tie the financial piece to it. Those numbers can be very useful that you have there to tell that story.
Yeah, a friend of Lake of Hopkod is trying to get East Central Florida Planning Council to get a grant from DEP to do a new ecotourism study of the North Shore. So that'll probably get a lot more play than my publicity on it. But
well, don't sell that short, because here's another interesting story. I put my family. We put solar panels on our house 6 years ago now, and the reason we were able to do it, I'm not any technical expert on how all that works, is I heard about this group called the Central Florida Co-op, the Solar United Neighbors, SUN, and by participating in that co-op, they vet the installers. They negotiated a price that the installer makes much lower than the average market price, because he knows he has a guaranteed consumer base to sell to. And the point of this story is to say that this all got started when two 14-year-olds, I think 14, they might have even been a little younger, two 14-year-olds went to Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth at the movie theater. And one of them came back and he said to his mom, hey, I want to do something. I think what I want to do is I want to get solar. And the mom was supportive, but was like, I mean, do you know how much this is going to cost? I don't think we could really go this route. How about you go talk to the neighbors? And so the two 14-year-olds canvassed the neighborhood, and that built over a period of about 24 months. And they created the very first solar co-op, and that started to build. The person that started the one here in Florida heard that story on NPR, and she went to her church later that week and said, hey, I want to try and do something like these 14-year-old kids did. And this guy she didn't know raised his hand, and I interviewed both of these adults. I didn't get the chance to talk to these kids.
Mary.
Yes, Mary DePoy, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And
Michael Cohen.
Mike, that's right, yep. And together they created this co-op, but now there are 13 different states in the District of Columbia that have these Solar United Neighbors entities that help people put solar on their roof. So, again, as Margaret Mead said, you never underestimate the power of one individual. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
So has the insurance industry did they give up? Like, did they say, oh, the big oil companies, you win, or what was up?
No, I think they're still applying pressure. It's not on the same level as the fossil fuel. We've seen it play out here in Florida, right?
Yeah.
But they haven't been able to apply the pressure in Congress like the fossil fuel industry has, particularly within the Republican Party. But also within the Democratic Party, right? Like, historically West Virginia and Michigan and all that, that's been very problematic in terms of taking a progressive position on climate change. But no, they have continued to be active, but they have not been a match for the richest corporations in the world.
I think you need to ask us, do we feel that this impacts us directly, and then when we see our insurance bill, we can say it has definitely tripled impacted me.